It was some 30 years ago that Sri Lanka, one of the most enchanting lands on earth, the Paradise Island, sacrificed its beauty, prosperity, and the safety of its people to the unwisely calculated gains of war. Historical circumstances created by political ambitions and divisions between two ethnic groups led Sri Lanka into chaos, devastation, and loss of life, creating nothing but deep, painful cracks and scars across the very fabric of the entire nation. What ideally should have been one land and one nation took on the stress and strain of war to prove yet again just how unnatural, self-hurting, and futile it is when people take up the path of destruction to create a new world. No tree has branches so foolish as to fight among themselves. There were attempts made to avoid ultimately resorting to war. However, instead of trying to reach a political settlement to the ongoing disputes, an organization emerged that decided to take up arms. The LTTE soon eliminated all other Tamil political groups and organizations and began a series of attacks on civilians and government institutions alike. From that point on, there was no turning back. The government realized that the only option it had in order to finally put out the fire had been to build a new fire. The fire to end all fires. A swift military action was required to dismantle the terrorist organization, which in reality held the entire nation hostage, Sinhalese, Tamils, and Muslims alike. In an appalling demonstration of how all humanity and reason have been drained from their desperate actions, the LTTE virtually took hundreds of thousands of civilians hostage and turned them into human shields rather than laying down its weapons. After the battle was over, hundreds of thousands of innocent Tamil civilians poured into the army-held territories, desperate, impoverished, and frightened. Many of them were born into a world that knew no freedom, no tolerance, and held no choices for them but fear, devastation, and pain. The LTTE ruled with an iron fist, crushing each and every attempt to question their authority. The Tamil population in LTTE-held areas in the north and east of the country had been indoctrinated to resent the rest of its nation and its institutions, the Sri Lanka Army being one of them. This was an incredibly harsh and inauspicious emotional and psychological environment for the Sri Lanka Army, tasked with winning the hearts and minds of Tamils. And these hearts and minds had to be won. The government and the army knew that without this ultimate victory, no national reunification and final reconciliation would be possible. The real work for the government of Sri Lanka to ensure lasting peace has started, with a new task for the Sri Lankan Army, a great challenge, quite simply described as 5R. Resettlement, reconstruction, rehabilitation, reintegration, and reconciliation. Some of the deadliest traces of the LTTE terrorist rule were the fields of landmines, indiscriminately spread without any documentation all around the area. The population, ex-LTTE cadres and civilians alike, were held in the IDP camps, both for evaluation and accommodation purposes, as they had no place to go before the land had been cleared of its mines. Therefore, demining was the very first task that the Sri Lankan army has been entrusted with. Valuable help had been provided by several international organizations, but most of the work had been done by the army's own forces. And all those who know what kind of work entails clearing minefields can have nothing but respect for the expertise and the bravery of those who are actually doing it. The minefields are being cleansed one by one, enabling the gradual return of the internally displaced persons. However daunting, the demining operation has been only the beginning of the resettlement process. The brutal civil war had destroyed most of the infrastructure, including people's homes. This called for the rebuilding and the construction of houses, roads, schools, hospitals, and all other essential infrastructure. "30 years of conflict left these areas completely underdeveloped. Roads had to be constructed in order to reconnect the north and the south and reunite the country. Again, the government of Sri Lanka made available all of its available resources for the new roads to be built and the old ones reconstructed. Railroads, power lines, water pipelines, and many other infrastructure projects commenced simultaneously. Valuable help is being provided by international donors. Indian housing projects and rebuilding of the railway lines, roads constructed by China, and assistance from the European Union, Asian Development Bank, NGOs, and INGOs. With the development of the transportation routes, traveling between two previously detached parts of the country has become much easier. The first tourists in many years have started pouring into the region, giving a boost to the tourist industry and connecting the island's diverse cultures at the same time. With the war ended, Army soldiers are now made available for the unprecedented and crucial task of rebuilding the country. The Army is building numerous houses in all the war-affected areas, most of them financed from its own budget. What it really meant was that Sri Lankan soldiers had to give parts of their own rations, and often even finance donations to buy whatever material was needed to build a house. Most of the soldiers engaged in building these homes had no home of their own. The population of the war-ravaged areas relied heavily on agriculture for their livelihood.